Let's get straight to the point. One of these two watches is a 60,000 euro Patek Philippe Nautilus. The other one just looks like it. That one is actually a 500 euro high-end replica, and today I'm going to show you the most important tells to spot a fake right away, so let's get started. As replicas are getting better and better, it has gotten significantly more difficult to tell an authentic watch from a fake one. This is not only an issue for those who work or deal with watches on a day-to-day basis, but especially for those who are new to the hobby, as it is extremely difficult to spot a fake if you do not know what to look for. And it gets even tougher if you do not have a reference watch to compare it to. The Patek Philippe Nautilus 5711 replica I'm showing you today is shockingly by far one of the best replicas I have ever seen, even better than the Rolex replica I have covered on this channel before, which also brings me to my first question for you. Let me know in the comments down below right away which one of the two watches shown here is the authentic one and which one do you think is the fake. So to prevent you from making a 60,000 euro mistake, I will show you the 7 most significant characteristics of a high-end replica. The first distinctive mark is also the one that is comparatively the easiest to spot if you have an authentic reference watch at hand, and that is the color of the dial. Both watches have a sunburst dial as well as the well-known color gradient from light to dark. But what's definitely different here is the shade of the typical Patek blue. The authentic Nautilus has a blue dial with a light green tint, whereas the fake clearly looks blue without any tint. Surprisingly, the sunburst looks really good on the replica, something which most replica makers mess up as they tend to overdo the effect. But it's the dégradé on the replica that also shows a slight difference, as the authentic dégradé is much more pronounced in comparison to the replica, making the effect more visible. The problem with this characteristic is that it is extremely difficult to spot without having a reference watch in hand. And honestly, I wouldn't have noticed the color difference without looking at an authentic one side by side. We are going to look at some characteristics you will be able to spot without having to have an authentic watch by your side, but first let's have a look at the case. Okay, so let's start with the case shape and the overall size of it. The proportions do differ slightly here, and you can see that by looking at the following 3 features. Number 1 is the brushed surface of the bezel, which is a bit wider on the replica watch. Many who own an authentic Nautilus are probably going to spot the difference here. Additionally, the edge of the replica is a bit rougher, as the edge on the authentic watch runs more smoothly and looks more high grade. Number 2 is the crown on the right side of the case with which you wind the watch. The crown on the replica sticks out more. And difference number 3 is the height or the thickness of the watch. The replica is not as thin as the authentic watch, which is caused by the movement inside the replica, as they are using some run-of-the-mill movement that is not as thin as the authentic one, but we're going to talk about the movement in a minute. Unfortunately, something has to be said that many surely are going to dislike. This 500 euro Nautilus replica is really well finished. Only when taking a closer look into the details, you can see differences in 2 main areas. You can spot the first difference at the flattened, polished edge of the watch. On the authentic watch, that part is really pronounced, giving the entire form a very elegant look. On the replica, on the other hand, that part is also present, but it is less pronounced and looks more like a regular edge. The second difference is the brushing of the steel. Both watches are made of stainless steel, but the fake watch has a rougher brushing, which you can spot even without magnification, as the brushing of the authentic watch is really smooth and subtle, basically perfect. The engravings on both watches, for example on the butterfly clasp, are basically identical, and differences are not visible with the naked eye. When it comes to the hands, our 4th distinctive mark, we are going right into the tiniest details, and we also have our first mark for which we do not necessarily need a reference watch. When looking at the authentic Nautilus, we see perfection. Basically, no little specks of dust or anything, a perfect polish, but most importantly, the sides are finished evenly without any disruptions. On the replica, we can see the big imprecisions. Not only do we see more bumps and residue on the hands, but we can also spot finishing irregularities, which we would never see on a higher end luxury watch above 1,000 euro or so, and definitely not on a Patek Philippe. So definitely make sure to grab a magnifying glass to be able to spot the differences here, which means that spotting any irregularities or disruption should definitely be a warning sign for you. Characteristic number 5 are the stick hour markers on the dial, and unfortunately the differences here are significantly less obvious compared to the hands, but if you look close enough you will be able to spot them. Overall, hour markers on replicas are known for their sharp edges, and we can also see that on this Nautilus replica. Its hour markers are pretty much rectangular, but nevertheless they are still the most well-finished hour markers I have ever seen on a fake. But let's be real here, there are watches within the luxury sector that cost more and are less well finished than this one. On the authentic Patek, all hour markers are nice and even with rounded corners which you can see without using magnification. This is also causing that super nice three-dimensional look that the replica is missing. The sharper corners on the fake are also causing the double sticks at 12 o'clock to be very close together. It almost looks like they are merged entirely. On the authentic one, you can clearly see a gap in between these two thanks to the rounded corners. For tile number 6, we have to stay at the dial and have to take a closer look, as this is the point which shocked me the most. Usually the lettering and the overall structure on the dial of a fake look really bad compared to the authentic one, as we could see on the fake Submariner that I have already reviewed. But in this case, the lettering on the replica is razor sharp, applied to the dial without any blemishes. Luckily, I was able to look at a couple of authentic Nautilus watches, and as you can see here, on a 13-year-old authentic Nautilus, which has a slightly different dial than the current versions, that the lettering on the dial is, compared to the fake one, even a bit less precise. And even in direct comparison with the current authentic Nautilus, the differences here are honestly too inconclusive to really tell them apart from each other. But luckily, you're able to spot visible differences at the date display. Whereas the date on the authentic watch is crisp and sharp, the white background of the date disc on the replica shows some sort of linen-like structure underneath, but you would definitely need a magnification glass to spot that. We can see another small difference within the structure of the dial. As I've mentioned before, the dégradé and sunburst look impressive on both. You can see on the close-up that the dial on fake has a slightly rougher finish with some added irregularities. The dial on the authentic watch stays immaculate even below an ultra macro lens. So the last distinctive mark is also the most noticeable, and lucky for us, the Nautilus has a see-through case back, so everyone can look straight into the movement. And that's where we can see two things. So first, you can see that the forgers really tried their best to replicate every tiny detail of the movement. Starting with what looks like a Miyota movement, a regular mass-produced movement, which you can find in many watches around the 100 to 500 euro price point, they have made a one-on-one copy of the Patek Philippe movement. But the finishing is not only slightly but significantly worse than the finishing on the authentic watch. Rubber polishing and an overall grubbier looking movement, so to say. You can also tell that the lettering was not done by hand but has been engraved by a machine. Though the placement of the components might look the same at first glance, you can see how some parts are not in the right spot when you take a closer look. For example, we have a different sized middle part of the rotor here. But there's also something you can immediately see if you know what to look for. In an authentic watch, the manufacturer exclusively uses rubies as bearing jewels, which tend to look a bit more violet in color. The forgers must have used some cheaper material, maybe even some type of plastic, as the bearing jewels on the fake one looks almost red. This is especially visible when comparing the jewels on both balances. All this might be due to the fact that bearing jewels on the replica movement are not being used as actual bearing jewels, but are more some type of decoration to ensure the overall look. It's also interesting to add that winding and setting the time feels almost the same on both watches, but the rotor on the replica does rattle a lot more when shaking the watch, and it continues to spin loudly afterwards for a couple of seconds. The rotor on the authentic Nautilus is audible, but it's definitely not rattling and not as loud. Okay, I think now you see how replicas have improved over time. Many of these characteristics can vary in terms of their degree, but if I would only be allowed to give you one piece of advice, I would definitely tell you to look at the hands with a magnifying glass. The hands are almost always the part on the replica that are the least well finished part in my experience. But what about the movement? Well, with a model like this, we're lucky that the original has a see-through case back, and so therefore the replica has one too, and we can spot the differences here, but that's not the case with all watches. I mean, almost all Rolex models have a full steel case back, for example, so looking at the movement here would be rather difficult, as you would have to open it first, which I would not recommend doing in case you're not experienced in doing so. So the best way to save yourself the damage of buying a replica is to either go to an authorized dealer or to a trusted pre-owned dealer of your choice. My last piece of advice would be to always trust your instincts and simply do not buy the watch if you have the slightest doubts about its authenticity. Okay, so now you know the 7 distinctive marks which help you to identify a fake watch, and you also know how to prevent yourself from burning thousands and thousands of your hard-earned money on a replica. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell to get notified whenever I post a new video. And that was it for today. Thank you so much for watching and spending some time with me, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.